Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Joining us now, Joshua Kaplan, reporter at ProPublica, on really it's two pieces. The first you put out, I think it was in August or sometime over the summer, Armed and Underground Inside the Turbulent Secret World of an American Militia. And you had a lot of reporting and a lot of like pictures and stuff that you could only get from somebody on the inside. And just the other day, I guess it was 2 days ago, you wrote the story of the mole in this militia. But let's just start with who is AP3 and give us a sense of both like who they are in and of themselves, but also in the broader context, particularly sort of like in the wake of January 6th.
Yeah. So AP3, American Patriots 3%, is what you'd call a 3%er group. And that might be a term that people are a little more familiar with. It's there's a few 3%er groups. They all are in this kind of loose coalition. And they're, one of the main strains of the far right these days, of the kind of organized militia style far right these days.
What does 3% stand for?
And 3% is it's a reference to this claim that only 3% of Americans fought in the American Revolution. And so it's this kind of idea that a small group of committed people can, by force of arms, stand up against tyranny. And they think that holds today. And so American Patriots 3% has long been one of the largest militias in the U.S. And after January 6th, some of the biggest, a little more famous militias, they had their top leaders go to prison because of the Capitol riot. But in part because of dumb luck, in part because of some various decisions that their leaders made, AP3 was never publicly connected to the riot. And so they, I think, gave this real case study of what's happening with the broader movement between these two historic presidential elections, 2020 and 2024.
And I just want to fill in some of these details. It's fascinating about, from your reporting, which is, when we talk about these other groups, Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys were sort of the most prominent. And these guys in AP3, they were like, we're going in on the inauguration. And so we're keeping our powder dry. And in fact, had a specific edict: do not wear your AP3 patches. There were AP3ers there, but do not wear your AP3 patches, essentially your uniforms, at this, because this is not an event that we're going to be formally doing. We're keeping our powder dry, as it were, for the inauguration. And so what I found fascinating about your reporting, and then we'll get to the mole himself, but what I found fascinating from your first piece in August was the impact, like the material impact the law enforcement reacting to January 6th had on the militia movement, at least initially, in those first years. I would not necessarily have predicted that. But tell us about that. And also tell us about the trajectory of sort of membership across AP3, and to the extent that you're aware of, the broader militia movement in the ramp up to January 6th, 2020, because I'm trying to get a sense of and I know this is the broad question you ask in all your pieces, is what now? Does Trump satiate this itch, or does it encourage it?
No, those are fantastic questions. I mean, the militia movement came in really strong to January 6th. They're coming off of 2020, where between the COVID lockdowns and the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd, and then the election, and Trump claims that it's stolen. These are all incredibly energizing moments for the movement. I mean, these kind of they really thrive on these ideas that there is some kind of something incredibly dark happening in this country, and the authorities are either asleep at the wheel and in on it. That's when they grow. That's when they do militant actions. That's when they're out in the streets with guns. And so they're riding this high, and that there's a direct line between that, all of that, building up to January 6th and the storming of the Capitol. And then there's after January 6th, there's this massive crackdown from the DOJ, from social media companies. And also, I think it's easy to forget at this point, for a stretch of time, the rioters, the militias, they were pariahs even in conservative politics. Trump, immediately after the riot, Trump was incredibly condemning of the people who committed violence that day, at least relative to he is now. And so these militias, their membership was plummeting. People were quitting. They were afraid of the consequences. They're afraid of being ostracized in their communities for being part of a militia. And the leaders of these groups, who are tend to be very macho, but they were afraid that the movement would not survive, that the backlash would be too strong, and they'd experience something like they experienced after the Oklahoma City bombing in the 90s, which is a stretch of like a decade where there's essentially no active militia movement in this country. And that all, that's a long way of, think they're at this real low point, but then things started to really turn around. And there's a few factors there that are interesting. I think probably the most important one is simply this change in the political climate. You started having Trump and other prominent Republican politicians changing their tune about the Capitol riot and starting to embrace the rioters as patriots, as political prisoners. And suddenly you start having people joining, rather than quitting because of January 6th, you have people joining militias saying, January 6th inspired me to join. And so AP3 started expanding at a dramatic pace again until it got to the point where they're getting so many new recruits that they were really struggling to keep up.
And you paint this in your piece about how these groups have a fluidity. It's not like you're a member of this group and only this group. There's like a bit of connectivity, and it's not full membership, but you can move from one militia group to the other, I guess. And what was fascinating was that, and we will, as Sam's been saying, get to the mole, but that this person who you were working with slept in the home of the man who was, I think, one of the heads of the Oath Keepers in the wake of Enrique Tarrio getting arrested by the feds. I'm not sure if this is directly connected, but he was arrested right before January 6th. And now Donald Trump is saying that he's going to pardon him or look into that case into pardoning the January 6ers. So like Trump himself, his reelection and his promises to pardon these people, it seems to have a direct line in terms of this energy picking back up again. I guess if you could expand on Trump's role with and him as a figurehead, not just with this militia, but with the whole right-wing militia culture more broadly.
No, absolutely. I mean, these militias, it is incredibly advantageous to these militias and for them to blur the line between their culture and the mainstream of the Republican Party. That's when they grow, and that's when they feel emboldened, when they start taking more public-facing actions. There's a version of this where these are a bunch of guys that just spend their time in the woods, and they're not actually doing things that have an impact on anyone else. Especially since Trump's election in 2016, they've gotten a lot more active. And so these pardons, the ramifications could be massive. There is no precedent for that kind of message of protection and support, especially coming from the White House. If the pardons are as sweeping as Trump has repeatedly during his campaign suggested they might be, if they include, even people who were convicted of assaulting police officers on January 6th in brutal ways. That experts in national security officials, feel that could be will be interpreted as a license for more extreme action, is essentially saying that you can commit even serious crimes and go unpunished if you do them for the quote unquote right cause. And that's a very, very dangerous message right now.
There was a couple of things I was struck by. At one point, the idea of how big of an umbrella. I mean, in the early 90s, when I was doing stand-up, I had a bit about somebody quitting the white Aryan nation to join the new white resistance front because the white Aryan nation didn't have a good dental plan. It didn't hate Puerto Ricans enough. But that's literally what's going on here, that there are some bigots who are like, Muslims are the biggest problem. Others are like, it's really Antifa or Black Lives Matter. I mean,
Women.
They all have their favorite sort of like boogeymen. And they, but this AP3, they have a big tent in that regard. Talk about that, because I found that sort of fascinating. They're like, as long as you, at the end of the day, it's white people. Is it white people for AP3, or is it what is the tent pole?
I mean, it's a great question. It's incredibly ill-defined. This what you would think would be the obvious question if you're going to go through, take the rather strange step of joining militia, is what is the point of all of this? And they leave that very, very vague. And so what they have are these kind of shared grievances. There's I think the most common through lines are gun rights, quote unquote anti-white racism, and things like COVID restrictions. Not that different from like grievances I think we're all very familiar with in the broader discourse.
Conservative grievances.
Yeah.
Conservative grievances. But these are just people who are convinced, who are just maybe a little bit more inclined. And I mean, most of the people you talk about and get insight to, they all seem to be, have some varying degree. Now, obviously, being an alcoholic and having conservative values does not necessarily, you're not going to join a militia.
Of course, yeah.
But there's a combination of of things, and the sense that like they're the last vanguard, or that nobody else understands what's going on or something.
Yeah, no, there's this sense that somehow by doing this, that they will be able to change the direction of the country. And really the trademark of this group, the thing that they all do that unites them together, and this is true for basically every militia, is paramilitary training. This incredibly, like this very militaristic, getting ready to, doing things like practicing storming buildings with semi-automatic rifles and doing ambushes with improvised explosives. But because they have such a wide tent, there's not, really even, they don't agree what the purpose of that is. And so you get in this situation where, there are these constant, very heated debates of amongst the group's leaders of, at what point should we escalate this? Is this now the time to commit mass political violence? And it's always, I mean, I think this is like kind of it's like this low boil menace that's at the heart of the movement. That's kind of constant, because sometimes that boils over into things that have massive real world consequences, but it's really unpredictable. And at least in AP3's case, those debates have gotten more intense as time has gone on. It's gotten, more radical, to the point where longtime members of the group were quitting because they were scared about all this talk about terrorism.
Well, and also the mole that you worked with, he came to that group, and I guess perhaps this might be a good transition to that part of your story. He came to this group initially as somebody who I know had a record in the past, perhaps wasn't finding his purpose in life and in society in the same way. And I mean, maybe that's what some of those other militia members have too, if they're troubled or if they're on the fringes a little bit of society. But he took it the opposite way and decided to, oh no, this group is dangerous and I'm going to speak out about it, which is a fascinating transition.
Yeah, I mean, he seemed like somebody who could have easily gone either way, and I think you write in there that they saw something of them in me. Like he had some of that. It just so happens, and maybe it was because he was gay, that he had just like one other sort of perspective that made him sort of like them, but not like them.
Yeah, I mean, and his politics are, I mean, they're radical in their own way, I think, but they're different. He is kind of a idiosyncratic leftist libertarianism, I think, is his broad worldview. And so there's certainly some overlap with the militia guys, a lot of meaningful differences. But I mean, as he tells it, he was a wilderness survival instructor after he got out of prison. This kind of like extreme wilderness survival, and crossed paths with this group through that. Didn't like the experience, decided to just move on. This was back in 2019. A couple years go by, and then January 6th happens, and he is outraged and disgusted and feels ashamed with himself for having helped the group in some small way, and so decides to try to do something and basically go on an undercover operation of his own devising as this sort of freelance vigilante. And then that becomes, something he does for over 2 years with the rather stunning degree of success.
Yeah, it's fascinating story. But one thing going back that maybe is from the first piece, Scott Seddon, who was the head of the AP3 at that time. What I found really interesting was that his success in recruiting seemed to be on a one-to-one relationship with Facebook moderation. Will you talk about that? Because we just heard yesterday from Mark Zuckerberg and his $900,000 watch, apparently, that that they are going to it's free speech is back on, but as Seddon basically, or your reporting says that Seddon saw Facebook throttle them and it hurt, but then saw it come back around the same time that Trump and the Republicans started saying that January 6th, it was just a bunch of tourists.
Right. No, that was the other key factor here in these groups being able to resurge. And it was, Seddon talked about Facebook as their greatest weapon. This was what got them. This was what made an idea that a kind of burnout, essentially, a guy who jumped between all sorts of, he was a model. He's had this very surprising backstory for paramilitary leader, one of the most successful in the country. But he was really good at using Facebook early on. And that was, I think, part of why he was able to expand this into something that eventually had, likely tens of thousands of people in it. And then after January 6th, the social media companies, including Meta, were really cracking down on paramilitary organizing. And this meant that when people were quitting the group, it was really impossible for them to rebuild their coffers and to reach a wide enough audience to actually be a meaningful national force. And so they were trying other things. They were, going around the
Joshua,
state.
let me just stop here because I think this is important for people to note, because we are led to believe that what they experienced is really almost impossible to do. Like, Facebook does not have the ability to surgically go in and inhibit a cohort that is, promulgating stuff like this. But apparently, according to that cohort, Facebook does have that ability when they deem it, when they're influenced by the exact same things that other people who may or may not want to join that group are, in terms of public shame and this is militias, right-wing militias are on the outs right now. So we're going to impose that. And then, like you say, the militia goes out and Facebook sort of relaxes it to the point where Seddon was aware of what was going on. Like he could see it in the how his posts traveled.
No, absolutely. I mean, these guys were, as worried as they were about the Department of Justice, they talked a lot more and with a lot more, I think, concern about Facebook in this time when they're talking about, like, is our militia going to be able to survive? I mean, this was a crisis for them because they just, suddenly they were having to do, kind of trying to recruit by handing out business cards at stores. And then suddenly, as you said, I mean, over time, they started realizing, oh, well, we can just do this. Like this is working again. Suddenly, we're getting people again. Suddenly, my account's been up and I've posted all these things, and my account's still up for months on end. We can be more bold again. And they're constantly testing this and discussing it and trading kind of observations about it. And so then eventually, they're getting as many as 50 people applying each day, which does not take very long to add up to a huge wave of recruits.
And that 50, is that nationally, or is that like in terms of like different regions? And this is one specific group.
Yeah, that's nationally, like 50 a day. So, I mean, these groups are, in the thousands or tens of thousands. They're not, this is not, million strong, but it's like they can have a quite significant force in terms of ability to do operations. I mean, the difference in terms of, the difference between a 500 person group and a 10,000 person group is, I think, that sort of momentum shift that happens when you're getting that large, I think has something to do with why we had January 6th, that these groups were at a really high point and they were feeling incredibly emboldened. And so maybe not everyone wanted to go and storm the Capitol who was in these organizations, but enough did.
And the premise of their whole operation is that we just need a few people who are super committed to do this. The other aspect that I found also fascinating and troubling is the way their relation. I mean, there's a lot of ex-cops in there. There you talk about one OBGYN who was at the Cleveland Clinic and then apparently left because but talk about that relationship, because a North Carolina sheriff comes up, Oklahoma City police come up in this. They seem to there's a very sophisticated understanding of like where the lines are of where, who can do what and what the value is, and we don't want to burn these resources type of thing.
Yeah, these groups view building good relationships with law enforcement as kind of fundamental for their success. One of the main things that they do is, do vigilante operations that put them in very volatile situations with a lot of guns. And if the police aren't going to actively support them, they want them to at least leave them alone. They're hoping that they will at least see them as friends. And so they put, I was aware that there's an unusual number of police officers in militias, but being able to see the tactics and the playbook and the sheer amount of effort that these militias put into building these ties, it's kind of like a business school group project. Like they have like all of these marketing tactics, and they trade tips for how to pitch it to your local sheriff and how to kind of rope in ex-police officer. In AP3, members receive spreadsheets from leadership with a list of every sheriff in their state, so they can mark who's friendly and who's not. And we're told to reach out to everyone and report back. Like it's a very, it's this long running and sometimes goofy, but organized and sometimes rather sophisticated effort to build these ties as widely as they possibly can.
Do you have a sense of how well trained they are in terms of like a fighting force? I mean, so clearly they say like, okay, we know in this given state that we have good relationship with this sheriff. So if there's a BLM protest there, just as an example, this is the place where we go and do our counter protest or our, assault or whatever it's going to be, because we know the sheriff is less inclined to interfere or may actually support us. But when they actually get into this thing, like, how sophisticated is their training?
I think it varies. I don't want to, it's scary. I've watched a lot of these videos. It's, a lot of these people are military veterans. It's also, vastly disproportionately represented in these groups. And so there's a lot of people with, official training and combat experience who's training other people. And so it's not like every one of these aren't super soldiers. But, these trainings they do aren't, using a pistol at the range. Like it's shooting a target with a sniper rifle from half a mile. That's a really long shot. There's these kind of organized efforts of like how do we as a group with rifles storm into a building, break this door down, search this, search this, search this. It's and so I'm not honestly an expert in evaluating, their firearms capacity, but it's, I think the Trump assassination attempt was about, 150 or so yards. It's, half a mile is way, way longer than that. That's a dangerous length to be able to shoot if you have the wrong intentions.
Well, this is fascinating reporting. I hope that particularly both the implications of the way the Republicans started to shift their rhetoric on January 6th. And frankly, the Facebook part of this, it seems to me to be incredibly relevant right now. It indicates to me that both, Facebook has an awareness of what they're doing, and also the implications of, like, when we talk about radicalization from these social media accounts. I don't know any better example. We're going to put links to both pieces, both the Armed and Underground and the Militia and the Mole at majority.fm and the podcast and YouTube description. Joshua, really, again, congratulations. This is great work. I just also want to note, like, he sent out this information to a lot of people, and you were the only one who, sort of followed up. And I know you guys, just from my own experience, must get like, dozens of these over the course of any given period of time. And it's hard to follow these up because more often than not, they go nowhere. But congratulations to you, your persistence and your reporting. Really well done.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Great chatting with you both.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.